Nature Breakthroughs with Dr. Wild Ben Goldman. Conversations with changemakers in a world gone mad. To discover what you need for personal, organizational, and societal change, get your free download of 3 ancient rituals smart entrepreneurs use to bounce back from shifts in the market and inside themselves. Go to www.naturebreakthroughs.com.
Yes, you pull them till they bite down. On the lies that you built from my doubt. I don't want money, I don't want cars, I just want to be free.
Hello, Liam Houston, and welcome to Nature Breakthroughs, conversations with changemakers in a world gone mad. And today, it's really gone mad, huh?
It really has. Like,
we're talking right as the U.S. Capitol is under siege, and the president has lost the re-election, and the House and the Senate for the first time since Herbert Hoover.
is that right?
Yeah.
Wow. Thank God for that. But yeah, it's pretty scary what's going on right now. And I really had to take a break before coming on here today just to get myself in the right headspace because it's pretty crazy what's happening right now.
It is. And you're the founder of the Transgender Wellness Initiative. And we met on Facebook because I've been doing these transgender living with change webinars, free webinars for parents and family members and friends of people who are gender expansive or transgender. And you sent me a note saying that you would love to come on the webinar if I'd like you to. And so that's how we met. So I was thrilled that you joined us on our call. And this show is all about change, and so that's what I want to talk to you about. Tell me about tell me this. What was the biggest change in your life?
Yes, well, I guess people listening to it won't know, although I am founder of the Trans Wellness Initiative, so they might have some hint. But yeah, I guess of the many changes of my life has been that I transitioned. So I don't know if people know what that means necessarily, but born female at birth, now living as male. People call it transgender. That's the sort of the commonly used term now. So I came out when I was about 18. I started medically transitioning and socially transitioning at 19, and I'm 25 now. So I work in an LGBT health center. I try to get involved with trans activism and trans causes wherever I can. And so that's how you and I met. I saw that you were doing these webinars with parents, and I just think it's fantastic because when someone transitions, I think the real truth of it is that it's not just the individual who transitions, it's their whole social circle, and parents go through a lot. And so I worked in London. I was in school in London, and I got to work with a lot of parents who did have kids who were transitioning. So I really got to experience that then and kind of see that the change that both kids and parents were going through. So I was really excited to see that you were hosting these webinars. Yeah, and really taking your time out to kind of offer this to people. And, I've now been on one of these webinars and really sort of seen how much to give. So yeah, I guess the change that I've been through has been transition, but it's meant so many different things for me and continues to be, and I'm excited to be here.
And I'm told that you're going to be a regular co-host for right now. So that's going to be great to be able to do it with you. And I've set up the webinars so that it's like a safe space for people with a loved one who's trans to talk, even if they're having trouble, with it. And a lot of people are having trouble with it for one reason or another. It could be that they feel grief, or that they have other family members that they don't know how to talk to about it, or there's been miscommunication or lack of communication with their trans loved one, or just lots of things happen. And so it was interesting to ask people what they would think about having a transgender person in the webinar. And the great thing was you made everyone feel so comfortable that people welcomed it. And so I'm hoping, this is just evolving. And the latest thing is I've had people wanting to come onto the program who are providers of one kind or another, either like they offer gender affirming surgery, or I had someone that's a speech therapist, because apparently people that transition want to have help changing the way they sound to be more gender, I guess,
Affirming. Yeah.
affirming. And then I think you suggested other types of service providers that we might have on, so that might be included. That might be a part of how this continues.
Yeah, it's a really, speaking of change, this whole field and the whole field of provider, whole field of trans healthcare in general is changing. And it's just a very interesting time to be involved. I'd say, you and I talked the webinars, and I feel it's important for me to only be involved like once a month. I'm happy to co-host and to sort of champion what you're doing. But equally, I feel that it is important for parents to have a space where it's just them talking. Oh, did you lose me there?
Second.
No, okay. As somebody was trying to call me, sorry. Oh gosh.
The sound is continuing.
Right. Do not disturb is on.
The sound.
Okay.
The sound was fine. The video just.
Okay.
You were saying.
Okay, so let me just. Yeah. So I think you and I spoke about how I do just want to stay in terms of being involved with the webinar to actually be present only once a month, just because I think it is really important for parents to have so they can just sort of talk amongst themselves and sort of work out what their feelings are and kind of share their experiences. But the whole field is changing, and I think it is exciting to see, that you're having providers reaching out and wanting to talk about this stuff. And, voice is one. People will do it when they aren't taking hormones at all, and they just want a voice therapist to kind of help them speak in a way that maybe appears more masculine or feminine. Oftentimes it's so that it's when someone appears one way, but then they open their mouth and sound very feminine, for example, they kind of get, people can tell maybe that kind of will call them out and then maybe misgender them. So sometimes a speech therapist will be really helpful, just sort of teach you different ways to speak. Also, when you're undergoing hormonal shifts, I think like a lot of young men will go through it at a puberty at a regular, at an age similar to their peers, so they can really learn how to speak together and learn, how those intonations work. But when your voice changes, it's when you're much older age, it becomes a very different thing. You've learned to sing it with a female voice, and all of a sudden you have this male register going on, and you don't really know what to do. So it's interesting that these things are becoming more common. I think more and more speech therapists realize that the trans community is really a community that they can work with and offer their skills. There's definitely more plastic surgeons getting into the field. There's more doctors providing trans healthcare. As I say, the field is changing. It wasn't until a couple of years ago, and unfortunately I don't have the exact year, but it wasn't until a couple of years ago where in New York State it is now mandated to cover trans care. So now a lot of surgeons are seeing that they can get into this field and have these surgeries paid for, which, change is complicated. And so sometimes it can be very positive. There's a lot of more people who have access to these life-saving surgeries now. And to be clear, not every trans person wants surgery, but for those who do, it's great to have the option. And then on the other hand, you have to be aware that when there are opportunities to make money, there are going to be opportunists who don't always want to communicate or really work with the community, but still want to kind of make money off of them. So I'm always very wary of it, but I'm super excited to see that people are reaching out to you and wanting to pass on this information. And, I think parents are concerned, and reasonably so, when their child says that they want to have like a physical surgery that can change appearance, that can really like impact your child's life, and often for the positive, but parents are worried. So it's nice to have them able to talk to surgeons directly and kind of get an understanding of how it all works.
I my my son is transgender, and he's been taking testosterone for, well, I guess almost a year now, and so his voice changed, and it wasn't just that it went lower, which I guess it did, but it really felt like I was talking to somebody else. I had this really eerie feeling. He has a cousin, or like a second cousin, I guess. And every time I heard my son talk, it was like I thought I was hearing this cousin talking. So, but he hasn't had any speech, voice coaching or whatever you call it. He just, his voice just started to change, not just the register, but the way he spoke just started to change. And yeah, that was strange. That was strange. He hasn't gone through any kind of surgeries yet. So I guess in some ways, maybe the voice is the biggest. Well, there's been physical changes. Look, he's growing up. People grow up and they change. And so the initiative, the Trans Wellness Initiative that you started. What kind of wellness? What do you offer in with that organization?
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear about your son, and we can certainly do that, because I think working with you when you're on the other side of it is so fascinating, and to hear your perspective is also like so interesting to me, and also makes me reflect on my own transition. So certainly happy to come back to that. So the Trans Wellness Initiative started because I have always been involved in sort of fitness and sport. As a kid, I wouldn't say I was super athletic, but I definitely love sport. I love basketball. But then, as puberty hit the kids in my school and hit the boys, they became so much taller, so much stronger. And it really got me discouraged from playing, and it really got me discouraged from going out there. I was always in the female sports. Sometimes the boys were out playing basketball and I was doing dance, which was infuriating. And, and then when I was growing up, as I got to about 16 or 17, I sort of knew who I was. I knew, that I wanted to transition, but I lived in a place where it just really wasn't going to be an option. I didn't really want to come out in high school. I just didn't want to do that whole thing. But I did get really involved with Muay Thai, with martial arts. And that was fantastic. And I trained really hard. I think it was really helpful for my mental health. But then when I went to university, I got in with the Muay Thai team. But then as I started to transition, I really dropped out of it. In my first year of university, before I transitioned, I was going 3-4 times a week, religiously, really, really training hard. And then my second year, I didn't go at all, just because, it's a very masculine space. It can be quite conservative, martial arts, although not always, but it can be. And I just felt that I just didn't feel comfortable doing so. Eventually, I joined the team again after transitioning, and it was great and it was fine. But all this to say that, I just found sports to be such a gendered space. And with the Trans Wellness Initiative, there's a heavy focus on sports and providing spaces that trans people can feel comfortable. Personally, I do fitness training. I do personal training of trans people, gensive people, and that can be just for general fitness. It can be, I find that it's so helpful with confidence. If there's specific like looks they want to train towards, we can kind of talk about that, about like what a typically male body looks like and whether they want to work out certain areas, what a typically female body looks like. But I find that a lot of times just training trans people, providing them a space, even just providing them a buddy to go into a gym, can really help them overcome those barriers and those fears and be allowed to access physical fitness, which, like, as far as I'm concerned, is a very human thing that everyone should have access to. But unfortunately, so many trans people I know just aren't comfortable going to gyms. aren't comfortable in these very like hyper gendered spaces. So Trans Wellness Initiative really came out of that. You know, we offer various different things, and I'm always looking for new ways to collaborate with people. You know, interested, like I've been looking through Nature Breakthroughs a lot. I really think it's cool what you do, and you know, maybe we could do some sort of retreat or something like that, but just sort of spaces where trans people can feel comfortable being themselves, feel comfortable in their physicality, and just know that they're safe to explore that. Because for me, physicality is such a key thing to this whole trans experience, but something that people are shut out of because of like the hypergendered spaces and just because of people's biases.
Wow.
I hope that answers your question.
There to unpack. What did you say the martial art was called? Muay Thai?
Muay Thai, so it's Thai boxing. Currently, I also do jujitsu, yeah, and mixed martial arts. And actually, right now, I have a coach who's just fantastic. I came out to him as trans after our first intro session because I felt really safe with him. He's working with me, and we'll solidify it into TWI as sort of like providing self-defense classes and providing like spaces for trans people to work out. And he's just super fantastic and super big advocate for all this stuff. So yeah, right now it's jiu-jitsu and MMA, mixed martial arts, but previously it was Muay Thai, which is Thai boxing.
Because I've done martial arts for most of my life. I remember as a kid when I did karate as a kid. And, you know, when I think about it, I remember that it was really hard to distinguish the gender of the people in the karate class when I was a kid. Part of it was I'm very nearsighted, and they would make everybody take their glasses and put them into a basket, which meant I could barely see anything. But I remember there being several people in the class that I couldn't tell whether they were a man or a woman, but they were bigger than me because they were adults, you know, and so
right.
They would hurt me, you know, as a kid. It was, and then more recently, I did martial arts in the neighborhood where I live, and you know, it was mostly kids, and they didn't make you take off your eyeglasses anymore, and there was less. Well, when I was a kid, there was a lot of sparring, and whereas now they make it more discreet, you know, the sparring part and the practice part. Now when they do it, they separate the, you know, the positions and the movements from the actual sparring. And I didn't participate in a lot of the sparring, but I did it a few times. And, you know, they would have us dress with like protective gear. Right. Again, they didn't make me take off my glasses. Instead, they made us wear helmets and stuff. And I got the distinct feeling that as an older man, I was like the target, and all these young teenagers were trying their hardest to kick me in the face, and it was really strange because I could feel my adrenaline just going through the roof, and not getting furious at these kids for kicking me in the face. You know, I didn't want to be kicked in the face. And there was one, this is just a silly story, but there was,
of course not,
one point where I got kicked in the head twice by these teenage boys. And then I had to fight this girl. And I was like, this kid is not going to kick me in the face. It's not going to happen. And I remember I thought it was gentle, but I kind of pushed her, kind of a kick, but more of a push with my foot in her, like her chest, and she fell down. And the sensei went over to her, and he was like talking to her in her ear, and I could hear him like saying, you know, don't worry, he's not going to hurt you. And he was like counseling her, and all of a sudden I realized that I had just kicked like probably a 10-year-old kid, like a little tiny kid. And she was a monster to me in my head because the adrenaline was flowing through me. And yeah, it was a very strange experience. I don't know what that has to do with what we're talking about, but yeah. I have also found martial arts to be a, a super, and I remember my son actually came once. I earned a brown belt in that, and they, and they have a, what do you call it, like a test that you go through, and they do it in front of people.
Mm.
One of the parts of it was that the sensei would kick you really hard, and you would have to withstand it. And
Mm.
my son was filming me on the camera, on the cell phone, and the sensei comes up and kicks me in the gut and like knocked the wind out of me, and I did like a backward somersault, not intentionally, but I was completely knocked over, and you could hear my son screaming in the back. It was really funny, but that's just silly talk. But definitely a big part of what's happened with my son, and I'm sure with other transgender people, is there's a kind, they have, the medical community has a phrase, gender, I guess, dysphoria, and
Mm-hmm.
that involves part of which I think is like being uncomfortable in your body. And
Right.
My son was very athletic when he was identified as a girl, and he was a ice hockey player and basketball player. I mean, he's played in all the sports. And then when teenager, all the kind of things happened, including when he came out as transgender, and for various reasons, he ended up gaining a lot of weight rapidly. And I think that contributed. Well, I don't know when it started, but I'm pretty sure that he had issues with his body that which ended up being a multi-year period where he really kind of stopped all forms of physical exercise. And I hear that he's now starting again,
Yeah.
to exercise. But what you're saying sounds like such a vital, it's such an important part of the, I'm using air quotes, the transition, but it's such a important part of the development of the human. And in the, well, you know what I'm saying. It's complicated because
I do. Yeah.
because it's
It's,
not just how, well, it's complicated because I think a lot of people go kind of in the early phases of this, like, don't like their body at all. I mean, that's true of a lot of people, cisgendered and transgender. They're ashamed of their body, or they don't like some aspect of their body. And I don't know if is part of what you do. I mean, part of that is I don't know if I want to use the word psychological, but part of it is it's work with our minds, how we our attitudes about ourselves.
Yeah.
And how physicality.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I would just preface that, I like to make it clear that it's not every trans person that hates their body, that dislikes their body. And I was actually having this conversation today, which is just like this whole notion of gender dysphoria, which has, I should look at the exact definition, but is sort of the general sense that you're uncomfortable in one way or another with your gender assigned at birth. But one of the criteria, I think the fifth criteria, is actually that, there's a sense that you want to change how you're perceived by others. And I think that's such an interesting part of this whole notion of gender dysphoria, is that some of it is about how you're perceived by others. And of course there's your internal sense and your internal gender, but to some extent it is about this external world around you and how people are interacting with you because of your gender, or because of your gender presentation, I should say. So I just find that, like, that's a whole nother route to go down, and I just find it really interesting. But yeah, I'd say for the people who do struggle with body image, with kind of feeling settled within their body, it's just such a intense experience. And it's just such an intense experience that maybe not everyone can relate to or understand. I mean, to the extent that people will go on hormones, will sometimes have surgery, and I am a big proponent, not that exercise will solve any of this, or that, you know, being physical will solve any of this, or will mean that someone won't need to have surgery. But I do think it's like an amazing stopgap. I think it's an amazing bridge while people are waiting. There's long wait lines. And when I've spoken to people, and in my own experience, just going through this whole thing, you can sometimes just become so dissociated from your body. You're just like, don't want anything to do with it, don't want to do with the body parts, don't want to do with just being in your body, full stop. And from what I've seen, and like some focus groups we've done with TWI, it's just that exercise routine. And this is true when the body is such a big part of it for so many people, really understanding what your body can do, and challenging yourself and moving just changes your whole mindset. You know, you may still want surgery, and that's fine. And I have nothing against that. And I've done what I've needed to do myself, but just being able to see what your body can do can really make you feel a little bit more inside your body and a little bit more comfortable. And I think trans people deserve to exercise as much as anyone else, and reap the health benefits from it too. Like, I think that's so key. And, you know, we've talked about how testosterone can make you gain weight just because of, you know, increased eating, whatever. Sometimes we're not growing at the same time that we're like taking testosterone and having increased appetites. So, you know, people can suffer from a whole host of mental health issues, physical issues, and exercise is super key to keeping someone healthy. And why don't we deserve that?
I mean, to go broader even, I think we're, you know, in the West especially, we're so in our heads, you know, regardless of gender, you know, so many people are very dissociated from their body. And, you know, exercise is one way that we connect, but it's not the only way. You know, there's all kinds of somatic
Agreed.
that can be super helpful to people.
Yeah. And I mean, that's something I'm interested too with TWI, is like exploring those other areas. I mean, my focus, just because of my own experience, is fitness, but yeah, want to work with practitioners who are doing like body work. You know, people do massage therapy, and I found that helps a lot of people. So I'm really interested in kind of like exploring, trying to be able to offer these to people. And, you know, even doing some research and kind of showing the benefits these things. And it is among, you know, it is wider than just trans people. It just happens to be sort of my focus in my area.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting and complicated space.
I try not to focus too much on surgery as far as my physical training goes. I think like I believe in exercise outside of it as well, and just as a wider thing that trans people but trans people should be able to access. But there is a unique thing that trans people face when it comes to like accessing these surgeries, and surgeons have requirements sometimes about like your BMI has to be below a certain weight, you know, below a certain number, and that can be for various different reasons. It can be health issues, it can just be like them being able to do the best surgery they possibly can, and it's controversial. But ultimately, if that is the case, and we need people to be able to lower their BMIs a little bit just to be able to access these surgeries, you know, like at least give people the tools, I think.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. What do you think are some misconceptions that people have about transition, or about being transgender?
Ooh, big question. Well, I'd say, first of all, if you or anyone in your audience hasn't watched Disclosure yet, it's on Netflix, documentary that came out maybe sometime in 2020. And it's just such an interesting look in how the media has portrayed trans people, and really a discussion with trans people of what what it was like for them to grow up with this media representation of trans people, as trans people being predators, as trans people hiding a secret, you know, being mysterious, this whole thing. I think disclosure is such a fascinating look at it. So I guess the first misconception is that we are, sorry, go ahead.
The name of the movie is Disclosure?
Disclosure, yeah.
On Netflix. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, it's great. I watched it and I made my brother sit and watch it with me. I think it's great. So I guess the first misconception would just be that, you know, we're not hiding out here in the shadows. We're not trying to get you. We're not, you know, trans women are not men in dresses. You know, they're certainly not men in dresses trying to be predators on women in bathrooms. Nothing, you know, all of that I think is total fallacy and fear mongering. I think also another misconception is that transition is a surgery, you know? Transition is the process. Transition is ongoing. For some people, they transition and live stealth, you know, I'm using air quotes there. Stealth being the idea that you present as the gender. For example, you know, you're born female, you transition to male, you live male, you never tell anyone. That's stealth. Or you tell very few people, or you know. But transition is not just one surgery. You don't just have a sex change, right? It's a whole process that looks very different for every different individual, their own problem. Some just and socially transitioning and just asking people to use a different pronoun to refer to them. Some people take hormones, some people have surgery. But yeah, just a sex change. You don't just go away somewhere, come back, and you've had a sex change, you know? So those are some big misconceptions. As a parent, you know, when your son first came out to you, did you have any misconceptions that you, or any conceptions that you recognized that you've since sort of like questioned?
Well, it came up this last webinar that I did, and someone asked, had I had any contact with transgender people prior to my son coming out? And I mean, I think the answer is no. I don't think I had ever, you know, although now I remember there was I used to live in the East Village in Manhattan, and there was a notorious gay bar that I went into once that was full of men in women's clothing. But I don't know if that's the same as being transgender. But I remember that was very startling for me. And, you know, everybody was drinking tightly packed together. And, you know, that was interesting. But other than that, I don't think I'd ever, I basically, no, I hadn't known any or been friends with or talked to any transgender person. And then another.
That you know of.
Oh, yeah, that I know of. Right. That's true. And then the other thing I was going to say is this, that I, you know, I have kind of a secret agenda in my in my program, you know, which is called Transgender Living with Change, and which is a misconception I think a lot of people have, is that the change that's required is often more in the people around the transgender person, you know, and when I'm working with parents or loved ones, you know, what I see is that they need to, well, change in a way. They need to change their attitudes. They need to change their mindset. They need to adapt or accept, or, you know, or grieve, or there's changes that they're going through. And that, you know, in some ways, like with what I saw with my son, and what feels likely to me, is that the person who's identified as transgender is kind of just returning home, they're not the ones changing there, but it's they're kind of expressing something that they may not have, that they may have taken a while to realize, to understand, but that's always been there, you know. And you know, so when my son came out, I I didn't, I don't even think I lost a beat. Well, that may not be true, but I feel like I very, very quickly became his advocate in this regard. But that was because there was so many other things happening to him at the time that were, well, frankly, life threatening, that this was like this was like an answer, and this was a path forward. And
Mm,
it was something to hold on to, and something to give me hope. I saw hope that he would get through those teenage years, which were particularly, difficult for him.
yeah. I mean, I love that what you're saying about so often it's just about the people around the trans person needing to change and kind of needing to adapt. And now that I'm a couple years sort of further into this, I do have sympathy and understanding of times the trans person will have been sitting with this news in their head and coming to grips with it for years before they've told someone. And then, and it's difficult because so often we want the people around us to quickly adapt and quickly accept what we're trying to tell them and share. And it took us time to come to grips with it. So sometimes it'll take other people, but I'm super glad to hear that you were ready to get on board. And this is why I'm really excited to continue working with you, because I've just seen how I think you grasp that fundamentally, and you're so willing to kind of put yourself out there to work with other parents and to just try to do a lot of the heavy lifting that can often fall on the trans person. So it's just so cool what you're doing, and that you're kind of putting yourself out there to do all this and to offer the space for parents. Because I get it, it's hard, but it can be really difficult, as we've talked about, just for the parents to be able to talk to their kids and sort of process these emotions when they also want to kind of support their child and ultimately just show unconditional positive kind of regard while they're also internally going through a lot.
Yeah, and I mean, I've had the experience like with my son where I don't think it was clear to him what he was feeling, or or that gender was an issue necessarily. I mean, when he was, it became clear, I think, but I don't know that it was always clear. And in the same way, talking to some parents, I've heard, it's become clear to, I mean, what I've seen is that they're not clear about what they're going through either. So like one gentleman came to realize in our group that he was grieving, and he hadn't identified that that was what he was feeling. He just knew something was wrong, and that he wasn't on fully on board, but he didn't know why. And as soon as he recognized that it was grief, it's just like everything became easier, and
Yeah,
it became more. It's almost, it's kind of like, when you have a disease and you don't know what it is. It's like, it can be healing just to have a diagnosis, even if it's a bad one. Just
yeah,
a name on it.
yeah. And the discussion of grief is so fascinating, because I think people are often, it's difficult to talk about, right? Like, who wants to talk about grief and losing and yearning? But when you kind of break the grief down, and please, like, tell me your kind of input on it. But I think if people are wondering what that grief comes from, like, from what I understand from a parent's perspective, a lot of the time it's just the grief about what you thought your child would be. I'm not a parent, but yeah, I get the sense that parents just, you build an image of what you think your child is going to be, and that is lost, right? In some ways you feel like that's lost when your child comes out as not what you expected. And then also, I've seen with parents, it's this grief that, you have this image of your child as one thing, and then, you think that because they're in a different gender or look different or sound different, you've lost what you had before. And I think we've talked about, and in some of the groups, it's the discussion of how you can hold on to what you had with your child growing up, and embracing how that has contributed to the like loving human they are today, the wonderful individual they are today, and how that whole past has contributed, while also kind of honoring your own grief and your own experience through the whole process.
I mean, grief is an emotion, and I don't really think we can control emotions. All we can do is feel them, and see how they course through our bodies and there are many ways in which there are many aspects to the grieving that can happen, and a parent doesn't necessarily have to grieve. Like for me,
No.
I think it was the opposite of. I mean, I felt more relief than grief when my son came out, like I said. But I do think that a lot of the grief is, and I think I learned this concept going through a divorce, where usually by the time you're getting divorced, your marriage is terrible. There's nothing to grieve about in the marriage, but what people grieve about is the future that they have lost. So it's their hopes or their dreams of the future that are gone. So the present might be like, I don't want this, but that's not. But so it's that the future. It's like you wanted to bring your daughter down the aisle, or
Correct.
whatever the projection you had into your child's future is gone, and then if you can realize that that's just imagination, that's just in your head, that's not reality, and just bring what is real is your child is here now and who they are, and there's nothing to grieve about. And usually usually the parents don't grieve about it. I mean, unless they have strong beliefs about gender issues, in which case again it's something in their head as opposed to what's going on. There are other aspects of it that are interesting, like there was a person in our group who, and this experience to me, the name changes. Usually parents, there's usually, well, not usually, often a lot goes into the naming of a child. Like my son was originally named, there were just like layers of meaning in the name that he was originally given. And there was someone on a call this week who said that his child was named after someone who had been a dear friend who had been murdered actually murdered in his home. And so when the child changed the name, it was kind of like he had to re-grieve. He lost the homage that he had given to the lost friend. But then what a burden.
Wow.
I mean, I was also thinking what a burden that child, that he was named after someone who'd been murdered. But there's grief there, just grief in the name change. And it kind of tests our ability to go with the flow.
And I think you're right. Labeling as grief, or labeling your emotion, is such a helpful way, and sort of like the first step in being able to like work through it and sort of let it go. Yeah, that sounds really tough, and it sounds like a lot of pressure on a kid as well to have that kind of symbolic name. I will say, on the positive side, if your child, not yours necessarily, but if a parent is going through this, and their child is open to sort of working with them on it, a nice way I've found for a lot of my friends is that if the parent is willing to share what they would have named their child if they were born, of the opposite binary gender, that can be a really nice way to kind of collaborate with your kid on it. I changed my name, changed my parents to have a name picked out for what I would have been named if I was born a boy. So, names haven't been such a big deal. I'm like, whatever I'm calling myself is whatever I'm calling myself. And I've really sort of not put too much stock in it. But, if you did have a name in mind for your kid, it can be a really nice way to share it with them and just let them know that that's an option if they want to choose it.
Yeah.
I do wonder, actually, from your perspective, I see a lot of times there can be a split between parents, whether divorced or married, just in how they take the news and how open they are to the change. I mean, did you, as much as you're happy to speak on it, have there been a difference in how you and your ex have taken the news about your son?
Well, one thing that was interesting is, well, first of all, when there's an aspect of this where a child that has been identified in one gender, they, like my son was a girl, but then basically he came onto my team, right? My team.
I've heard this before, yes.
Not that I was expecting that at all, but one, but he's very much, he's very close with his mother, but he came out to me first, which was unexpected. And he was very nervous about telling his mother. And so I remember helping him come out to his mother. And his mother took a little longer to get her mind around it, but she's all completely on board. But but it was more confusing for her, I think. And he was more hesitant to tell her. So that was kind of interesting. That was an interesting aspect of it.
That's funny about the whole teams approach. I found that I've heard anecdotally and also in my experience that men seem to often have that mentality, this team mentality. You're joining our side, and I certainly had a couple guy friends who definitely want to teach me the ways of the world and teach me all these classically male things, which has been interesting, because I approach this whole thing with really a sense that going through this whole process, that gender is so fluid and that we have a lot of social expectations put on us and that we should question a lot of those things. So it was very fun to have that team feeling and to really be welcome to the club. And then at the same time, when you've had experience being a woman and sort of seeing how toxic masculinity can affect people and all that, it's been an interesting transition. I remember, it was weird. It was almost a marker to me of how much I was quote unquote passing or coming across as male in the outside world, because, women would start to become a little more uncomfortable if I was walking behind them too closely. And I had to learn to sort of measure how far back I was walking and being aware of being perceived as intimidating or threatening. And so I continue to navigate it. And I just, it's fun. It's weird. It's a journey, but I do try to keep in mind not to kind of be too inculcated in the whole boys club and perpetrate a lot of that stuff.
Yeah. And I've had, I've had fathers in our group that have talked about being worried that, I mean, obviously there's different phases of the process of, someone just coming out, but in the kind of immediate aftermath of someone coming of a M to F, male to female. And he was very close with his former son, the son, and he was concerned that now that his child was his daughter, that he would lose that bond, that he had. That's like the opposite of the joining the team. I mean,
Exactly right.
I'm pretty sure that will all work itself out for him. But that's like an example of a fear, that happens when right at the beginning, early phases of this. And one other thing I just want to say is that our group isn't just for parents. It's for, so we've had spouses and,
Oh, cool.
asked me if a child of a trans parent could join the group. And I'm like, sure. So we've had friends, we've had an aunt, foster parents, we've had step parents. Yeah, one interesting thing that came up was a spouse. Someone asked the spouse, okay, so now that your now that your spouse has, I don't know even know if it's the PC way of saying it, but switched gender,
Yeah.
it came out, and I forget how he asked the question, but he asked it very kind of delicately, like, how does that work? In terms of your intimate relationship, and also, I guess, your sexual orientation. So it's kind of the classic question: if a person is straight and identifies as female, or I'm going to confuse myself, straight and identifies as female, and then identifies as male, do they become gay? And the other way around, and he didn't ask all that, but
That's what he was getting at.
I don't know what he was totally getting at. He might have also been getting at, would you lose your sexual attraction to your spouse once they've transitioned? And the person answered that they're like, they had an, like, let's say I was married to someone named, I don't know, Sylvia. This person said that they would be like Sylvia sexual, as opposed to like.
I love that answer. Yeah.
So it was just, the person answered by saying they didn't care what gender the spouse was. They were attracted to their partner. So that's a happy.
Yeah.
That sounds like a good marriage, but it's complicated.
Yeah. It's complicated. Yeah. I mean, what you're touching on, right, is the separation between gender and sex, right? And sexuality and sexual orientation. And you're touching on labels, right? Like, you can be attracted to someone, but like it then becomes this whole idea of identity and what do you identify as? Ideally, but I mean, I know it's not in every case, but it's something along those lines where you're attracted to the person you're attracted to. You love this person who's presumably giving you emotional support and love and everything. And, not all couples stay together through transition, but yeah, I think this is what I say when gender's so fluid, or through this whole process, I don't feel a need to sort of label myself as like liking one gender or another, or, it's just so fluid. It can be so dependent on the person. And, people label themselves differently. People I want to identify differently. And it's just, you see how it goes, I guess.
And another distinction that I found interesting to learn in this process was the distinction between identity and expression. And, that has a lot to do with, I guess how we show up, and our physicality, how, and that those are different, just like the sexual orientation and the identity is different.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm, you even said the way your son talks is different, and not just in the register of his voice, but just he acts differently. And it's you can really start to see how men or women are expected to act. You sort of understand the social codes and all. But yeah, people can identify one way and express themselves differently, and they absolutely have a right to. People may choose not to socially transition, but ultimately identify as a certain gender. And it's great if they have a supportive network or can recognize them for who they are. It's yeah, it is. And they're different, absolutely, between identity and what I think, sometimes, or at least initially, I may have expressed myself as, more typically masculine, and then I've sort of let that go as I've gone along. And, my identity in some ways has been just somewhere towards the masculine end of the spectrum, but that can change too. You can really double down on like, I'm a man now and whatever, but then that can sort of become more fluid, and sort of an understanding of how complicated it is and how many different things go into being a man, quote unquote. So yeah, I don't know. I'm still learning. I'm still sort of out there just seeing what it's like to be in a gendered body, I suppose.
And, I think if, I don't know, I could say as a cisgendered man, it's still a mystery what it means to be a man for me. I mean, I know
Definitely.
I don't question really that I'm a man, but I don't know. I remember actually the period in my life when I first started calling myself a man, as opposed to a boy. And that felt so
Mm,
awkward. And
interesting.
it wasn't immediate. It took years for me to feel comfortable saying I'm a man. I don't remember when I actually felt comfortable, but it wasn't 21, it wasn't 18. It took, I mean, I would say it, but it always felt like imposter syndrome, it took a while.
Yeah.
And, I had a parent say the other day, which is funny. It's like, this isn't, blue doesn't have a gender, red, pink doesn't have a gender. It's all, there's so many things that we think of as, sewing doesn't have a gender, or football doesn't have a gender. There's so many things that once you start, what is it? The red pill or the blue pill, once you enter this, once you open up this door, you realize how socially constructed the whole notion of gender is. And that
Absolutely.
it can be threatening because it's such a kind of basic guidepost to help us navigate the world. And when we lose it, the world becomes more dimensional, and it can be more confusing. But I
Yeah.
think it's a sign of maturing to be able to deal with that kind of nuance and and with that kind of uncertainty.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I love having conversations like this because, I talk to a lot of trans people and we go through our gender journeys and we'll hit puberty at different times. And it's not exactly the textbook way, but talking to people like you really brings out a lot of interesting things for me to think about. And I think also asks you to sort of deal with your own experience of gender, right? And yeah, like I've never thought about that switch between boy and man, and it's like very interesting. It's a period you go through, but as you say, like you have to kind of get used to at what point, you can comfortably say you are a man. So yeah.
I think we have over an hour of material here, and
Yeah.
it's been a real pleasure. And I always enjoy speaking with you, and I look forward to doing it on a regular basis at Transgender Living with Change. So thank you, Liam Houston.
Likewise. Yeah, thank you so much, Ben. I appreciate it. Oh, and now the fire alarm's going off. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you. Okay, cool.
You set a fire? Thanks for listening to the Nature Breakthroughs podcast with Dr. Wild Ben Goldman to discover what you need for personal, organizational, and societal change. Get your free download of 3 ancient rituals smart entrepreneurs use to bounce back from shifts in the market and inside themselves. Go to www.naturebreakthroughs.com.